This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Okay, so I'm going to have a chance to talk to you today about portfolio management in the age of disruptive innovation. For those of us on the call who have an engineering background, a lot of our careers are tied up in gestating these innovations, bringing them to market. And it's been a very disappointing return on those innovations over the past 20 years, particularly in large companies. The venture community has done reasonably well, but in large companies, we haven't had as much return as we want. And the book Escape Velocity is an attempt to address that issue. About a decade or two ago, a fellow named Clay Christensen wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma about many of the similar problems, and this is an attempt to say, what have we learned since then, and how can we perform better going forward? So to tee this thing up, we've been living through, my career has been through 4 decades of disruptive innovation. When I joined tech, it was the 1980s. Personal computing and office automation changed the complete landscape of just how work was done. It didn't have a big financial impact on business, but it had a huge impact on the quality of work. And then when that personal computing environment got hooked up to the internet in the 1990s, that really fundamentally changed the world economy. It allowed for the rise of China, it allowed for the rise of India, it allowed for this massive return on technical investment in that decade. It led to a bubble at the end of the decade, but it was an enormously powerful economic event. So innovation was getting a lot of return in that period. In the last 10 years of the first decade of the 21st century, the enterprise stuff kind of went on hold. But the consumer tech got a lot of attention, and broadband, mobile, social media has completely changed our lives. Again, not a big financial impact outside of consumer economics and consumer media, but a huge change in the quality of life. And now I think we're going to see in this coming decade, as we hook those facilities up to the enterprise backbone, again, we're going to see massive economic return. So there's a real opportunity to create return on innovation in this period. And the idea of this talk is to make sure that we line ourselves up, our corporations are lined up to actually take advantage of that. Now, the problem statement is kind of on this slide. These are all really, really great high-tech companies that no longer exist. And in a sector that is as rapidly evolving as the technology sector, if you don't keep up, you really do get left behind. And there's a number of companies on the bubble right now who are struggling not to get left behind, but who are very visibly struggling in the market right now, and several of them in our valley and around the world. So I think this is a pretty timely issue, and whether we're, as a listener, you may not be the CEO, you may not be on the executive team, you may be somewhere in the middle of your organization, I still think you need to participate in the dialogue of how do we not get caught up in this situation. So a lot of companies right now who've been very, very strong in the 90s and the last decade they've adapted. So these are 4 vital franchises. But if you look at their stock prices compared to the NASDAQ is the orange line here, and the dark line is the line of the company. You can see that they've kind of been sort of flat, and there's been in fact, in some cases, underperformed the NASDAQ. And so you think, wow, that doesn't feel very good. These are very successful companies. They make a lot of money. What's going on? And particularly when you compare them to 2 other companies, Amazon, who in the same period, his stock has gone up 12 times, so this is a little bit out of date, but roughly 12 times, and Apple, whose stock has gone up 50 times. And so you think, what did these 2 companies do that the other 4 companies, who are really great companies, not do? And that's where the escape velocity idea came from. So all the companies, including Amazon, Apple, Cisco, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, etc., they all live in a competitive set. They were established in businesses where they had established franchises. And what Apple was able to do and Amazon was able to redefine the pecking order in a new category. Actually, it was actually a new category, not their existing category, by setting a new standard. And they did that by innovating in a way that other people simply could not match. Apple, in the case of Apple, they actually did it 3 times. They did it with music, with the iPod, they did it with smartphones, with the iPhone, and now they're doing it with tablets, with the iPad. So it's really extraordinary performance. Amazon has not only expanded their existing business dramatically through innovation, but they've also added cloud computing, and they're the undisputed leader right now in cloud computing. And so that's a pretty amazing performance. And in each case, what the companies were able to do was leverage crown jewels that were unique to them. So Apple's design capability, Amazon's operational excellence capability, their ability to innovate against retail margins is extraordinary. These are things that are very hard for another company to copy. And so they were able to drive market adoption and create net new sources of earnings. And that's the big return on innovation that tech wants, which is, can you create a new franchise and graft it onto your existing franchise? And the innovator dilemma classic problem is that that's very hard to do because the existing franchise, resists that, and you have this, we often call it the corporate antibodies or whatever. And what I want to do is give you a slightly different framework. I think the antibodies metaphor has not been helpful. It makes it a very divisive situation, and it implies that there's no way to make the graft work. And I believe there is, and I think the intent of this presentation is to show you how. But in order to do that, we need to diagnose, well, why isn't it working, and then we'll talk about how to make it work. And we'll open this up for conversation at the end of this thing. So what did they do? What did these guys do? And you say, well, they caught a category wave. So one of the things you have to understand about innovation is the big returns on innovation is when you draft massive growth that comes from a new adoption life cycle. So the technology adoption life cycle is very familiar to people in high tech and in engineering. And that's where you gestate these things and get them going. But the truth is the really big returns happen as the technology gets adopted, but then we just get by more and more and more. But we bring search into our lives. We bring social networking into our lives. We bring mobile computing into our lives. We bring, virtualized data centers into our lives, cloud computing, et cetera, et cetera. So A and B are the big high growth periods, and that's called secular growth because it only happens one time. Then you get into a period of mature markets, and during the mature market, which can last for decades, you've now gone to cyclical growth. And now you look like other industries. Now you're looking to be more efficient, more optimized in your world. And then what you have to worry about in tech industries is the next wave of innovation can put you in a declining market, and eventually it can put you in a disrupted market where you're out of business. And the folks at Kodak with their film business, for example, went through a very, very painful transition there, as did Polaroid, et cetera. And right now, I would argue the people in the printing business are struggling here because less and less printing is getting done, at least at the personal level going forward. What you'd like to be able to do as an existing franchise is you'd like to acquire power in the secular phase, ride that up into new categories, and then harvest it. Use your worldwide support, your worldwide sales capability, your worldwide footprint to actually optimize it during the cyclical phase, and then get out of that market at the end. And if you're an established franchise, you're trying to do this for the second time. So one of the advantages of a venture franchise is you don't have anything resisting you as you're moving from left to right in this diagram. But once you're an established franchise, you have your C businesses, which are basically your cash cows. This is what keeps you in business. And you're trying to get a competition of resources is going to happen, as you're going to see in just a second, between those businesses and the next generation businesses. And how to solve for that competition is the goal. But so here's the deal from portfolio planning. If you say, what are we trying to solve for? It's pretty straightforward. I need to get some growth, and so I want to have some powerful new franchises. But at the same time, I need to have material revenues, which means I have to have performance. And so the tension is going to be between, do I put an asset against performance and get short-term returns? Do I put an asset against power and get long-term returns? Or could I ideally do both in the same situation? So when you're in that B part of the technology adoption life cycle, when it's secular growth, you actually are in that upper left-hand quadrant. So just to map the life cycle to this model, when you're in the A part, you've got a high growth business, but it's still small. It's the law of small numbers. So you're high growth, but you're not yet material. Okay, people are excited about you, but at the end of the day, when you're public, if you're a public company CEO and you're reporting out your earnings, you can't really say that we perform particularly well yet, but you have some very exciting prospects. If you're in a B business, you have that wonderful thing of saying, not only are we growing like a weed, but we are highly material revenues. This is an incredibly exciting place for us to be, and this is when stock prices, frankly, go through the roof. This is where Amazon got. This is where Apple got. This is where companies like that got. The C part is here. It's highly material, but it's no longer high growth. And so this is the steady as she goes businesses. These are not bad businesses. You definitely want to be in these businesses, but they're slower growth. And then there are the D businesses, which can be highly profitable, but they're losing traction, and they're certainly not growing. In fact, often they're growing negatively. And you have to be careful with D businesses because when they go away, they create a big hole in your revenue expectations that it's very hard to fill. So when you look at this, you look at a typical company, if you look at any of the Intels and the Ciscos and the Microsofts and the IBMs and whatnot, you say, look, we're looking for B businesses. But what you actually find is you find a lot of C businesses, which are very, very big and strong and well-established, but not growing very well. You actually find a lot of A businesses. You know, the people are spending money against R&D. They're growing new things. There are very exciting things going on. You have some D businesses, which are like, well, they're hanging on. They're still helping with the revenue and profit, but, you know, we got to wean ourselves off of them. Ideally, we would divest them. But the issue is, what you don't find is very many B businesses. And that's why those stock prices are staying relatively flat, and they're not having the 1,200 or the 5,000 or whatever appreciation, because essentially what the stock market is saying is, look, you're in the same business you were in 10 years ago. Why would I change your stock price? You're great at it, but I thought you were great at it 10 years ago. So the frustration in working for a Fortune 500 tech company and seeing all those cool red dots in the bottom left-hand quadrant and saying, why the heck can't we get those into the upper left-hand quadrant is the big issue in tech today. So you say, okay, so let's just deconstruct that and say, so why isn't that working? I mean, it's not like people are going out of their way to fail. So what's going wrong? So if you look at it from the point of view of the big businesses, you say to the big businesses, well, why don't you do some R&D, that renewal? Why don't you renew back into a high growth quadrant? We said, well, we're trying to, and we do. We spend some money and we get back there for a while, and then we spend some more money and we get back there for a little shorter period, and we spend some more money and we get back there even for a shorter period. I realize these graphics, by the way, are homemade, so I apologize for that. No expense was spared because none was incurred. But the point of this thing is the following. What you see here is a well-established market that is highly material. That's what that big blue circle was about. That's a very good asset. Customer relationships are established and products are well known. And you can make, and cost of sales is low. You can make a lot of money in those kinds of markets, and these companies do. So their performance, their short-term performance is actually excellent. Some of that money is spent on R&D. It's largely incremental R&D to make things better. And for a while, better is better. That's why those blue circles move to the left into the high growth period. But fairly quickly what happens is good enough starts becoming good enough. And when good enough becomes good enough, what happens is unit growth continues. People, they buy more of your stuff. But because the commoditizing competitors are using discounting in order to get business away from you, the revenue growth as a total measure flattens. And so what happens is you have the market will bifurcate into a bunch of commodity players who are just kind of a race to the lowest possible price, and that's the commodity part of the business. The higher branded people will do a value-added piece, but their part of the pie, even though the pie is growing, their part of the pie is shrinking. And the commodity part of the pie is outgrowing the value-added part of the pie. And so what it creates is a situation where you have to run faster and faster to sort of stay in the same place. And the truth of the matter is the fact that we're spending so many assets against that business because the people running are saying, man, I need to do something to keep this, balloon up. But the truth of the matter is the return on that innovation investment is not as good as it ought to be, and we're actually spending more there than we should be, which is painful to say to everybody, but it's just a fact. So that's kind of the issue with number one. So the issue is we're probably spending too much money both in R&D and in go-to-market against our established businesses. We need to put them on a much more optimized regimen, not starve them to death, we don't need liposuction. We just need, good health practices, right? And we tend to get a little bit flabby, particularly in the longer you have an established enterprise and franchise, the easier it is to get flabby. Well, that's okay. So, but fine. What about our cool new red stuff? And people say sometimes, well, big companies don't innovate. That's baloney. There is always really, really cool stuff going on in big companies, and that's what these little red dots represent. But you say, well, why didn't the red dot? So what happens to the red dot is they try to get to scale, and then they kind of just, after a while, they fade out of existence. And the next one comes along and says, well, we're going to get there, and he tries to get to scale. It's like, well, then he goes away. It's like, well, okay, I'm the Messiah. And at some point you start looking at this and say, I don't know that there's a Messiah around here, guys. I mean, we've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. I haven't seen anything get over the materiality line on my watch. What the heck is going on? And when you look at that issue, wait here to get my. When you look at that issue, the issue is the products are immature. So you say, okay, well, but that's true of venture-backed companies too. The relationships are few, and the cost of sales is high. Now, that's true of a venture-backed company, but a venture-backed company has nothing else to eat. So basically, they have to work those opportunities. But the established franchise still has these highly mature products with very good customer relationships where the cost of sales are low. And so the people in those companies are trying to say, well, should I put my best people against the stuff that's easy to eat, or should I put my best people against this stuff? And the problem, initially you say, well, I've got enough resources for both. And you do for a while. And the little guy's little, he's very exciting, and there's always people that want to work on him. But then the little guy gets a little bit bigger. And at some time he gets to the point where he's going, okay, I'm growing fast, but I require an overlay sales force. I need specialized marketing. I need complex services. And the more revenue I get, the more money I burn. And at some point, the performance metrics of the company get jeopardized by this thing. And they're going, well, wait a minute. I'm committed to creating a certain gross margin or a certain revenue target or a certain profit target. I can't do that and also support this high growth opportunity. And in particular, the field organization cannot bear this burden because the field organization is under enormous pressure to make their current commitments, and they prioritize resources to do that, and inevitably when the new commitment gets to a certain size, they just get starved out. And so the next generations are left to get by as best as they can, and the truth is that ends up them not crossing that line. They don't cross a tipping point and become a new franchise the way the iPod music business and the smartphone business with the App Store has, or the way that web cloud services have at Amazon. They just end up getting assimilated as the next set of features in a kind of a slower growth world. And the stock market goes, okay, well, so I'm not going to change your stock price. So this is a situation where we're underfeeding a herd of hungry heifers, and they never reach material size. And this resource contention problem is not genuinely solved for in most corporations in most years' strategic planning, and it's our fault, and we can solve for it. But we have to solve for it, we have to really acknowledge what's going on. And so to understand what's really going on, you have to say, look, there are three horizons where you can get a return on investment, particularly in a public company. It's true of any company, but a public company, this is where it's most visible. You can get it in the next 12 months. And not surprisingly, public companies do very well in investing and harvesting within the year's period. Their compensation's set up that way. The reporting out of the street on financial performance is set up that way. No surprise. The point I wanted to make earlier is I also believe that very large companies, if you take the horizon out beyond 3 years, they actually do very well here too, because they set aside a certain amount of corporate R&D, and the R&D is put to work, and it's put to work on exciting things, and cool stuff comes out of Horizon 3. The challenge is when they try to onboard any of those cool businesses and bring them into the present. So now the Horizon 2 is a transition play to go from really cool, exciting product, maybe it has 10 or 15 or $20 million of business, but we're a $5 or $10 billion corporation. It's a rounding error. We need to get this thing to $500 million and eventually to $1 billion to have it be a material part of our world. That means it's got to go through Horizon 2, and when it gets to Horizon 2, it gets stuck. And so the key, you say, well, what happened there? Why did it get stuck? Well, the metrics for Horizon, I'm just recapping what I kind of said before, but let me just be brutally clear about this because we're going to have to solve for this. The metrics of the Horizon 2 business dilute the current fiscal year's performance. That means they're using scarce, valuable resources that I could be putting against much easier business that gets much more profitable. I could get much better short-term returns from it. Whereas this business produces little revenue and it typically has very negative cash flow. You're putting a lot of money in, you're not getting much out. The intent in Horizon 2 is to get it out in years 2 and 3 and 4, but the problem is we tend to be measured against year 1. They're also incredibly distracting to manage because they're not aligned with your current relationships. In fact, usually your best relationships, your most long-standing relationships are often threatened by whatever it is that this new Horizon 2 business is, because it's destabilizing the thing that they've always done business with you before, so they're not particularly happy, and they certainly are not easy to, you can't leverage those relationships into the new business. There's often an unclear plan of attack. In a Horizon 2, you're kind of continually revising things, and if you're a big field organization, you say, come on, guys, I can't continually reorient a worldwide global field organization. What are you talking about? And the truth of the matter is, when it comes down, push comes to shove, there's a direct competition between Horizon 2 and Horizon 1 for scarce resources. Who gets the A players in sales and marketing and professional services? The person who's got the Horizon 1 commitment says, hey, if you want me to make my number, I need these people. And the Horizon 2 person says, well, I need them too. And so the interesting thing, and perhaps the single most misunderstood part about innovation is, innovation in large companies is not an R&D problem. It is a go-to-market problem. It is not that we cannot invent these things. It is that we cannot deploy them at scale. Because when we get to the deployment at scale challenge, the resources that are necessary to deploy them at scale are contended about. So that's the problem we have to solve for, and the visualization of this is very straightforward. I used to think all my professional life I thought of innovation as a funnel, where you had lots of things at the beginning and you funneled them down to a few great businesses at the bottom. I now believe it is an hourglass, and I believe that the Horizon 2 pinch point in the hourglass is the critical problem to solve for, and that what we need to do is do a series of prescriptions specifically against the Horizon 2 challenge, and that's what the next slide's about. This is the last slide in the presentation, but there are 5 prescriptions here, and each one of these I think is mandatory. So I have the advantage of being an older consultant, and I'm not a CEO. I can just sit in the sidelines and say blah blah blah. But I believe that the way you solve for this thing is in five behaviors that are currently not common behavior in the best of boardrooms, and the best of boardrooms are pretty darn good, right? The first of these is do not plan and resource your Horizon 2 businesses at the same time that you plan and resource your Horizon 1 or Horizon 3. You'll see that Horizon 1 and Horizon 3 don't conflict with each other because they're not competing for the same resources. The people that do that far advanced research, you don't really use them in a Horizon 1 business, and the people that run and sell the Horizon 1 business stuff, you can't really use them in far-reaching research situations. So Horizon 1 and Horizon 3 can get along forever very happily. But Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 cannot. So the first thing is don't plan the Horizon 2 initiative at the same time that you plan the Horizon 1 initiative. Plan it the quarter before. So since most well-run organizations start their annual planning in Q3 and finish it in Q4, you do your annual planning for the Horizon 2 business in Q2. And you resource that thing, and you resource it on a no compromise, no excuses basis, and then you ring fence those resources, and they are not allowed to be put back into the pool when you do the Horizon 1 planning in the following 2 quarters. The second thing you have to do is you have to organize the Horizon 2 business as a temporarily independent business unit, which has a general manager who has direct control over all the functions necessary to make the business successful. So not only do they have direct control over R&D and product management and product marketing, they have direct control over sales, over marketing, and over professional services, which is a very, very strange thing to ask a large corporation to put up with. Typically what you do is you actually leave the people in the line organization that they report into, but you second them to the general manager, and the general manager gets to draft them during the planning and budgeting process. And once they're drafted, they're assigned to that general manager, and they cannot be reassigned by the line people that they report to. So the reviews are done by their boss, but the reviews are based entirely on their performance for the general manager. Now, that is a very uneconomical way to run a large corporation. And so once you get through Horizon 2 and you get to Horizon 1 and you've become a material business, you have to then dissolve back into the traditional organization where salespeople report into sales and engineering people report into engineering, which is, by the way, where sales and engineering people are happiest. But you've now gotten the business to such a material size that the line organization is actually an asset, not a liability. But prior, when you're trying to scale the Horizon 2 business, The line structure is actually an obstacle, not a help. It's a bug. It's not a feature. The third thing then is how do you measure performance in this critical period? And the only thing that matters in a Horizon 2 business is, can you get it to a material size where the market, instead of resisting the growth of the company, actually capitulates and starts actually cooperating to increase the growth. You see this with any new market initiative, both internally and externally. Until the market capitulates, both competitors and inside resources are giving you what we call the doubt of the benefit. At some point, when you have enough success, they actually switch to giving you the benefit of the doubt. That's the tipping point. Once you get the benefit of the doubt, all of a sudden, you start getting sales that you didn't ask for. Partners bring you business. Customers give you references. People want to be on the project. The line salespeople want to sell your product. Everybody wants to work in your unit. And all of a sudden, your performance goes from being very, very challenging to very, very excitingly productive. That's the tipping point. And until you get to the tipping point, nothing has happened. And if you don't get to the tipping point and you say, well, we're going to withdraw the overlay sales force, or we're going to draw the extra attention, or we're going to dissolve the integrated business unit before you get to the tipping point, everything goes back to where it started. And that's the most discouraging thing to watch in a large corporation. So the only metric that matters is getting to the tipping point. The challenge with tipping points is you can only see them after they've happened. So what you typically have to do is put a stake in the ground that says, in the next 6 to 8 quarters, this is the tipping point metric, this is the market I'm going to tip, this is how we're going to know, and I'm going to either get there or die trying. The fourth thing then is to tie the compensation program to this outcome. So this means having major variable compensation tied to the tipping point success. Now, people do this for the people inside the Horizon 2 business unit. It's not enough. If you're literally going to have a Horizon 2 success, you have to apply this to every executive equally. If you look at the two companies that have had success in our example, Amazon and Apple, it's no accident they were both being driven by the CEO. And the CEO made it very clear to everyone on their staff this was the priority. And the real lesson that you watch Steve Jobs do here, he actually did it with the fifth one, which he said at the last point, which he did these things one at a time. There was not a situation where he said, well, I'll start the iPod and the iPhone and the iPad all at the same time. The iPod was a major business. It had reached complete maturity. It was a complete business before he got into the iPhone business. And the iPhone business, he had the iPad ready to ship. He did not release the iPad until the iPhone was a completely material business. And at the time of the iPod, the Macintosh had gotten, the iPod got the overwhelming resource advantage over the Macintosh, and then it was the iPhone. The iPhone got the overwhelming resource prioritization over the iPod, and then when the iPad went once again. So the key lesson here, and it's probably the single most counterintuitive lesson in this whole thing, because people think, well, H2 initiatives have such a low success rate, I clearly have to ride more than one horse. The fundamental lesson here is you don't have enough resources for more than one horse. If you think about how you're going to actually fund the Horizon 2 business, you're funding it out of your operating income. You could probably get by with 95% of your resources and still make your numbers. There's always 5, maybe 6, 7% that you can use for something else. But you don't have 10 to 15%. Nobody says, well, with 85% of the resources, I can make next year's numbers. Okay, so you probably have somewhere between 5 and 7%. How many initiatives can you bring to material size with that amount of resources? It's amazing to bring one, and you sure as heck can't bring more than one at the same time. So you must prioritize the Horizon 2 initiative over all other initiatives. You could have as many Horizon 3s on deck as you want. You can have as many Horizon 1 businesses. You can run them in parallel. But you can only get one Horizon 2 business, sort of through that knothole in the hourglass at a time. And that is the single least likely to be followed prescription on this page, and it is absolutely the kiss of death not to follow it. So there's a lot of stuff we've been doing wrong, but if you look at this page, it's not crazy, it's not unexecutable, and so I am extremely supportive and optimistic, actually, that the next generation of innovations will have a higher hit rate by following these ideas. Okay, so that's kind of what I've been up to, and that's kind of the conversations I've been having with a number of the executives in the industry, and I'd like to kind of throw it back over to Ryan here at the point, and then maybe we'll have he's going to say a couple of words, and then maybe we'll have some open discussion if there's Q&A. I'd love to get your comments, and I'd love to get your questions.
Jeffrey, if you're ready.
Ready to go. Thanks a lot.
All right. So the first question is, how would you address the barrier of corporate culture towards innovation?
So, cultures don't set out to not be innovative. What they do is their compensation and their management structures are biased toward performance. And what we need to do is create a more balance between performance and power, which means we have to hold ourselves accountable to creating power. And I would argue that the simplest way to do that is to say, look, if we don't get one of these Horizon 2 businesses over that materiality line in a given decade, if we don't even get one of them over, then we've got to hold ourselves accountable for that. And I think there's been an enormous amount of frustration, but at the end of the day, the compensation systems still compensate people for milking the old cow. So I don't think it's as big a culture problem as it is a compensation and governance problem.
Thank you so much. Sorry, let me take myself off mute here. All right, thank you so much. All right, the next question is, are you discussing at this point only sales and marketing people as opposed to research and development?
So the truth is, in tech, the research and development people end up becoming the general managers more often than the sales and marketing people do. So, and if the person who's right in the middle of this thing always is some version of either a product manager or a product marketing manager or a product line director, that kind of person. So I think engineering's up to their hips. The thing that is, I think, the mistake we've made in the past is that we thought that the problem could be solved by adding more engineering to it. I don't think we need to add more engineering to it. I think we need to add more focused and more committed go-to-market to get the engineering going forward. Now, when you get those go-to-market resources, you're still going to have to adapt the solution to the marketplace. It's not like the engineering challenge goes away, but what we've been doing is we have not been solving the go-to-market problem. We've just been adding more and more and more and more engineering, and that's not a workable solution.
Thank you. All right, a question from Rick here. What is the best process or selection of selecting the best H2 project?
Yeah, this is probably the single most contentious issue because, particularly in a large corporation, you'll have multiple divisions. Well, every senior division manager is going to have their set of Horizon 3 candidates wanting to get to Horizon 2. And the way we've always operated large corporations is we've implied that there was sort of a fundamental right to always get Horizon 2 coverage whenever it was that your business was ready to move into Horizon 2. Well, that's why there's always 3 or 4 or 5 Horizon 2 businesses competing for that 7% of the field resource that's available to share. Well, you can imagine if you have 6 or 7 things competing for 7% of your resources, how ineffective that's going to be, and it is. So you must prioritize. So that prioritization has to be led by the CEO, and it has to be enforced by the CEO. And it's probably become the CEO's number one job, and I regret to report that most CEOs do not perform it.
Okay, thank you. We won't tell any of the CEOs that.
Well, I think the CEOs are getting the message from the stock market and their board of directors. I don't think they lack for information.
All right. Well, a company like Google that seems to have a lot of H1 initiatives in progress and also seems to push multiple initiatives, benefit from pushing just 1 or 2 H2 initiatives.
Okay. So I think when companies are in the first decade, or Google's now kind of in the middle of its second decade, they're still pretty plastic. They have a lot of sort of youthfulness in them. And that is a period when, and of course, Google has this fabulous cash cow from their search business. So they can actually run a lot of experiments. And they have run an enormous number of experiments. The issue is, can you get them to material size and consolidate them? And I think it's reasonable. When Microsoft was in that period, it got its operating system business there. It got what became their Office business there, and it got their SQL Server business there. So they got 2 or 3 businesses kind of that felt like pretty much all at the same time. They might not have been. So I think at that point the field is still plastic enough. There's still enough elasticity there that you can and there's enough surplus resource to play the game a little bit more more than one at a time. That one at a time thing, that hourglass thing, becomes painfully true in your third decade, and probably any time after the latter part of your second decade, and from your third decade on, you now become an older person. Right? You don't have the same body type, so it's harder to do.
Well, I won't say what decade I'm in. All right. From Randy, we have the question of, your prescription covers time, structure, metrics, people, and quantity. How do you see the culture being changed to adapt these prescriptions?
Okay, so this is coming up again. So let me talk more specifically about culture. We've spent a lot of time thinking about culture, and there's two sort of dipoles in business culture, particularly in the tech sector, that you're on, and typically you're on one dipole and not on the other, and either one can work, but they're very different. So one is a dipole between the creativity culture and the command and control culture. And you typically have a command and control lead, and you have a sort of rebellious, creative thing, and the idea is, can I get the creative thing into the control culture? That one historically has failed. That has probably been the culture that has had the most trouble with Horizon 2, because the creativity culture creates all this cool Horizon 3 stuff. The control culture guards the Horizon 1 businesses like an army, and anything tries to get from Horizon 3 to Horizon 1, it gets killed. So that culture where you have the creative lab and the command and control operating group is I think not going to solve for this problem. The other dipole that's been developing over the last 2 decades, and I think is the one that works, but is still highly challenged today, is between a competition culture and a collaboration culture. So a competition culture holds people very accountable to individual results, and it tends to be Horizon 1 oriented. But the collaboration culture tends to be able to take the Horizon 2 responsibility on much better. It's very adaptive. It's very customer focused. It tends to try to do the right thing. It understands that you can invest in power in the future. It's willing to make sacrifices in the present in order to achieve future goals. And so finding that right mix between being competitive in Horizon 1 but collaborative in Horizon 2, if you look at like the changes of leadership that have been happening at Cisco, the changes of leadership that have been happening at Microsoft, those are two places which have been historically very competitive and non-collaborative cultures, and they've both put an enormous emphasis on collaboration in the last decade. Cisco had tried to do it with councils and boards. That didn't work as a structure, but the desire to become more collaborative was important. If you look at the leadership changes that have happened in Microsoft over the last several years, they've all been swapping out really brilliant but highly egocentric competitive leaders for much more, equally brilliant, I would argue, but much more collaborative leaders. I think that's the pole that works. So bringing a collaborative, competitive dynamic to your culture, I think, is the right way to go.
Thank you. So before I ask you the last question, and again, I want to thank everybody who submitted a question. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to all of them. I'm going to remind all of those of you that are still with us, if you'd like to download the slides, I'd ask that you do that now, because once this webinar is over, they won't be available. However, what will be available both on Geoffrey's site and on our YouTube, the Stanford Center for Professional Development YouTube channel, we will be going ahead and posting this presentation, this webinar, to the YouTube channel. So will Geoffrey, and we'll also have it on the Stanford Center for Professional Development website. All right. And again, and before I ask you this last question, Geoffrey, again, let me thank you on behalf of the Stanford Center for Professional Development for giving us opportunity and your knowledge. The last question is, where do you see the acquisition strategy in this model? Can companies combine an acquisition with their own tech innovation to get to the B product and leverage some of the resources of the acquired company?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it made me realize that I really should just have incorporated another slide into the presentation to cover it. So once you get to a certain size, it's almost impossible to get a Horizon 1 business purely from organic growth. It just takes too long. If you're a $10 billion company, a material size is $1 billion business. If you're a $40 billion company, it's a $4 billion business. I mean, I would argue that 5 to 10% is when it starts to become material, and you really want it to get to grow toward 20% of your total revenue. So how do you then, the real question is, how do you use organic versus acquisition? The problem with just acquiring straight up with having no organic presence in the market prior to that is you tend not to know what you're doing. So I think the and therefore you acquire a company which is just a misfit. One of the most visible ones right now is Autonomy with HP. Set aside whatever shenanigans or lack thereof have gone on. This was a situation where HP should have been organically in the market much deeper and understood these companies better from the point of view of a competitor, and also having their customers give them feedback on it and then go forward. So the prescription I would suggest is that you organically use your Horizon 3 resources, build businesses to $100 million or so at least, maybe $200 million, whatever, organically. And then from that basis of knowledge and using the general manager of that integrated business unit as your most critical decision-making resource, pick the companies that you can afford to buy and then buy up. A great example of this was how Cisco handled telepresence. It entered the market. It created a business of about $250 million to maybe even $500 million organically. But the bigger part of the market was being captured by a more mid-market product rather than a high-end product from a company called Tandberg. Cisco bought Tandberg. They bought it very knowledgeably. They were able to integrate those capabilities into the company very successfully. So that's a great example of innovate first and then acquire to get to the final scale.
All right, well, that ends today. Again, I want to thank Geoffrey Moore for joining us. I want to thank all those who have stayed with us and joined us today. This ends our webinar, and thank you for joining us.